And thank you everyone for joining us today. I guess you have a pretty good idea of what we're talking about, which is prompt engineering. That's a term that is quite common. Maybe it's not exactly engineering, but we're going to talk about how to get really great results out of AI models. We're going to start with a little bit of AI basics and safety. I should say, if you have been to one of my sessions before, some of this will be a recap, but please stick around. I am going to go through some of the content we've done before, but we're going to build on it and move beyond the basics that we started with here, including AI safety and the things you should and should not do with your AI, how to think about it. We're going to talk about a couple of different AI frameworks, or prompt frameworks, sorry, including the interview method. We're going to talk about how some of this is changing with the concept of context engineering, and then we're going to save some time at the end for the Q&A. And I would encourage you to ask questions during the session. That really helps with engagement and especially calming me down, and so I don't talk so fast, which is a bad habit of mine. But we will have a long Q&A at the end. I'm happy to stick around if you do have a longer question. Even if it's only sort of related to the topic today, please stick around, and I'd love to chat with you a little further here. So one more bit of clarification. What we're talking about today is chatbot style AI tools. AI means many, many different things to many, many different people. And so just to clarify, we are specifically describing the ways that you interact with ChatGPT, Claude, Copilot, Gemini, Grok, and the 10,000 other options that you've got out there, essentially conversational AI platforms. So we will be sticking with ChatGPT for the demonstration purposes here. That's where our training account is. I've got all my weird prompts in my own personal Claude and Copilot account, so I don't want to show you that. Before we go in, let's do a quick pulse check here. If you want to throw up the poll, Matthew, I'm curious where everyone's at with AI right now. Are you just starting out? Are you a regular user? Or are you like me and like to think that you kind of know what you're talking about a little bit and are using AI strategically? Mostly, I just want some information so that I can tell where I should be focusing my efforts. There's a little bit of variability in the demo in the middle here, and I might spend more time on a different section depending on how the audience is. That's interesting. I was expecting kind of a bell curve, but it looks like we're about a 50-50 split with just starting out in regular user, and only 3 people brave enough to say that they kind of know what they're doing, which is awesome. Okay, so I think hopefully this content really suits what you're looking for there. It is a little bit more basic, but it will build and talk about not only how to get more out of it individually, but start moving into using it as a strategic lever in your organization. So thank you everyone for the responses there. That's awesome. And so let's start by talking about what AI actually is when we're talking about these large language models. It's really just sophisticated autocomplete at the end of the day. Your mental model about how these tools work will impact the way that you interact with them and will really help you get a better sense of how to improve when you're using them. The underlying tech has existed for quite a while, but in recent years, we've discovered some ways to make them a lot more powerful, and especially we've trained them on massive, massive piles of text instead of just, chess moves or how to play Super Mario Brothers. That's really it. It's still just using statistical analysis to create plausible responses based on the patterns it sees in all of the text, like the entire internet. And this explains both why it's really useful and why it sometimes fails. So as much as it's useful to talk about what it is, we should also talk about what it isn't, and that is not a brain. It doesn't think or rationalize. It's all just pattern recognition and pattern matching. It can look a lot like thinking, but a great example that you can use here is that it doesn't know that Ottawa is Canada's capital. What it knows is that in text about Canada's capital, Ottawa is statistically likely to be there. And so it can be quite accurate. And in fact, often it is. But it also means that when it's wrong, it's very confidently wrong because it wants to sound like it knows what it's talking about. We call this hallucination, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment here. But the point is that human judgment is very essential. These are assistants that are helping you be better at your job. They're not replacements for you. A really helpful framing here is that it's a very fast intern who's read everything online. It doesn't have any memory, it doesn't have any judgment, and it will lie shamelessly. So the accuracy element is really up to you. And any questions so far? No, nothing yet. What I like to call this actually is the anthropomorphizing trap. I actually got that right this time. You don't want to fall into some of the common traps that can come when you start thinking of this as a thinking, rationalizing being or a person, which is trusting the outputs, deferring to its judgment. It doesn't have any, sharing sensitive information with it, or not thinking critically because it sounds confident. It sounds human, but it really isn't. It can be useful to talk to it like a person. And in fact, this can even influence the type of output that it's giving you if you use conversational language to discuss what you're trying to get out of the tool. Just don't forget that it is actually just statistical, plausible answers. So didn't mean to do that. Another fun safety element I want to talk about here is AI data and training. If you're using a free model, by default, it is training on your prompts and responses. I think that's true about every one of these tools that I talked about earlier. All of them that I'm aware of have a way that you can switch that off, and you can say, don't train on my prompts and responses. But there's very likely that you have put data in that is now in the training data set for these tools. They are working on protecting this information. The training set isn't something they publish publicly, but there are things called jailbreaks where they, bad actors can pull this information out of the training data set, and so that information could potentially be revealed. This becomes less true if you are using the paid models, or if you're customizing your training settings, or you have governance in place on how you can use these tools. But as a best practice, if you don't need to put in sensitive information, you shouldn't. And one of the ways that I would recommend that you do that is, instead of saying, I'm working with smart dolphins, you can say, I am working with client name in brackets. And the AI tools actually handle this quite well, and will continue to use, client name as the placeholder for that client name. And you can do a search and replace after the fact to fill that in yourself. And so just something to keep in mind, that you should treat anything you put into these tools, especially the free ones, as potentially reaching the public eye. So manage your settings and be thoughtful about what you're putting in. And then back to the hallucinations. This is the last safety bullet I'm going to talk about today, but AI will make things up with complete confidence. If it doesn't have an answer, it will just generate statistics. It will fake citations, or in some very interesting news cases, even make up case law, which will make a judge very, very upset. So most of us aren't in that situation where that's going to be an issue directly, but you still need to remember that it's just generating plausible text. It's not lying exactly. It just is trying to make up something that sounds right. So you want to treat AI like drafts from that fast intern with no judgment. And in fact, I'll even give an example that I've given ChatGPT. This was a few months ago, so things have changed a bit. A FAQ, and asked it some questions about it, and it quoted the document directly, but in the generated text said exactly the opposite of what was in the document. Even after I corrected it several times, it was still kind of arguing with me. Eventually, it got right. But this is a massive area of research and development, so don't let this be discouraging to you. This is just a part of that skill set that you need to develop to really get the leverage out of AI. If you are verifying facts instead of doing all of the work and verifying facts, you will become faster at many tasks that you do day to day. Any questions so far? No. So let's click on my slides. Let's get into the actual content here. The landscape of AI is shifting constantly. Anyone who used it for more than a few months has recognized how much it's changed in that time. And so, what you're doing today might not be optimal tomorrow. What you were doing 6 months ago probably isn't necessarily optimal today. So, as an example, I spoke with someone on the weekend who has a custom GPT they built based on GPT 4.0, and it worked really well for them. They moved that over to 5.2. They just switched the model in the dropdown, and it suddenly didn't perform as well because they had worked with 4.0 to sort of design their prompting for that model. And so what I want to leave you with today is that the real skill you should be building is your iteration and adaptation, sort of keeping up with this changing trend. You can't assume you'll come out of this session and be an expert and you don't need to do anything else. This is an ongoing practice, and it's changing rapidly, as everyone can imagine. So experiment and learn. The world is discovering how these tools work, and that applies to us as well. It's our new slide tool, so I don't remember what to click on. The arc we're going to cover today is a roadmap of 3 separate schools of thought when it comes to prompting. Task focused is what we've covered in the past, sort of these acronym-based prompting methodologies. Then we're going to move into what is sort of the new thinking in this space. And there actually is a question. I'll pause on this one. So if you need to verify the source and citation, isn't it going to take a very long time, even longer than not using AI directly? Any easier solution? There are a couple of things you can do to solve this problem, which is to ask the tool to do some verification, and it'll do some additional follow-ups. You'll get better accuracy that way. They are doing this built into the models as well. But the real answer is that you have to verify some of these facts, even if you're writing it yourself. And that if that's the only part that you're doing manually, then you'll gain efficiency that way. That's kind of the way that I think about it. It's not something you're going to get right away, but over time, you'll even get better at verifying that information quickly. So hopefully that answers your question. But sorry, let me jump back here. We're going to start with task-focused prompting. We're going to move into sort of an evolution, some new thinking around how to use AI, which is as a thought partner, helping you think through your problems. And then the last one is business context or context engineering, which is affecting the way that AI models are being developed, but also influences the way that we plan to use AI, especially leveraging AI in a business context. And so let's start with what I'm calling the LinkedIn AI alphabet soup. There are a billion, not literally, mnemonics that are all teaching the same core ingredients here. And, we talked about graced in one of my previous sessions. But you'll see they use a lot of the same letters. The answer here isn't really that one of these is going to be the end-all be-all and solve all of your problems. It's more that you want to use this as a way to remember a memory aid of the elements that you need to think about when you're doing prompting. And so comparing these side by side, you can see there's a lot of patterns between each of these different mnemonics. You see that role appears in almost all of them. Context, goal is the same. Format or output structure is somewhere in there in most of them. You've got examples. And so what happened here is that as people started working with these models, they started realizing that there's certain common elements that you need to enter in order to get a good output from the tool. So they started building these structures. And so those tended to have kind of the same core elements or the same ingredients, but in some ways, some people are making flatbreads and some people are making muffins. There's a little bit of variation between these different frameworks, but at the end of the day, you're still making some kind of bread product, You can look at some examples where there's some keys here. Crispy, where there's experiment as one of the elements, or roads, that's the sense check. That's one of the elements I was just talking about in terms of verifying. These, again, the AI makers are starting to build some of these into the models and the core system prompts that they have. And so you'll see at the end of a lot of the weaker prompts that we're going to put in, it's actually suggesting that we give it some of the information that are in these things. And so what do each of these mean? The different core elements that overlap here, you'll see that the commonalities tend to be things like role. So who should the AI be? Is this an expert at a certain topic? Is it someone speaking with authority? Should it speak like a grandmother or a LinkedIn influencer or, a pirate? If you haven't tried that, it's actually kind of fun. The goal or task. So what do you actually want? This is kind of obvious, but, maybe you want a detailed report. You want ideas for social media posts. You wanted to rewrite an angry email you drafted to your boss, or maybe feedback on that email, or counseling after you hit send, maybe a job search. What context does it need? This is the most interesting one, and the one that I think is the most important is what surrounding information does the AI need in order to answer this question really well? Who are you? What's your business? What region are you in? Is there any quotes or is there text related to the topic? And in a lot of cases, not all, more context you can give it, the better. I'll use an example of preparing for the next meeting. If you have a transcript of the prior meeting, you can use that to inform the agenda and the plan for the next meeting. That's something built into some of the Copilot features that are really cool. Audience is the contrast of the role element. So role is who is speaking. Audience is who are they speaking to? Are you talking to beginners on the topic? Are you talking to experts? Are they board members, executives? Are you talking to children? We've got the format element. So how should the output look? This could be, 17-page executive report, 3-paragraph email, some bullet points, or an image if the model supports that. You have to clarify what you actually want. What does good look like? That's the examples element. Something that can be powerful here is even giving examples of, say, a sales sheet. If you have a sales sheet for another product, you want them to have consistent formatting, you can put the sales sheet in, and the models are clever enough that you can say, don't take the content of this sheet, but look at the format and give me something that matches all of these elements. And it will use all the other context you give it to write a sales sheet that could slot directly in, and in some cases even produce something that looks nearly identical right out of the gate. And then constraints. And this one's the one you see the least, but it's still an important element. You want to tell it things to avoid, like certain kinds of language, or don't touch on these topics, or don't reference this product, and that sort of thing. And so you won't need all of these different elements at the same time. It's just a good checklist, especially when your results aren't working. If you try to do something, instead of starting all over, or in a lot of cases people just give up, you want to look back to this list or whatever framework you choose and say, did I miss some element of this framework that is giving me weak output? And so what we're really trying to do here is narrow the field down. When you think about what these tools are actually doing, if you just give it a very generic prompt, it's going to pull an average of all of the different answers related to that topic in its training set. What you're doing is narrowing the field of your request. You're saying, I only want responses related to this part of the topic. You're getting a more specific slice of everything that the AI knows and getting that output instead. Got another question here. Yes, we will provide the slides. If you reach out to training@smartdolphins.com, we can give you a copy of the slide deck, and it'll be available on our YouTube channel after a couple days, I believe, as well. Okay, so let's do a couple of demos here. Again, if you have attended one of my other sessions, you might have seen some of this in the past, but the example is pretty good, so I like to use it. And as much as I'd love to do the prompting live, it does take time for ChatGPT to actually respond. So it's a little faster for me to kind of preload these and walk through them. But we're going to use a really generic and frankly bad prompt. We're going to say explain data privacy. And we're going to get a very generic answer that covers extremely broad topic. And this is interesting if you want to know more about the topic in general, but obviously there's so much variance that you can even see. It says, tell me your context. Like, what do you actually need from me? Because this probably isn't useful to you as it is. And so the first thing, I'm going to use the RACE model. So role, audience, context, and example to narrow this down. I'll start with role. And the first role I'm going to give it here is you are an expert on Canadian data privacy legislation. Explain data privacy. And what you get, it starts referencing SIN numbers, and it starts talking about specific concepts within PIPEDA. It says, just because you're in Canada doesn't mean this is the full answer. You need to be thinking about your province too, because there's privacy laws there. And so again, you get something that's pretty generic, pretty broad, but we are starting to narrow in a little bit. So let's move on and talk about audience. And so in this case, I've actually got a contrasting example. We're going to start by talking about Canadian privacy legislation and sharing that with an audience of high school students. You don't need to say audience, but it helps. And so you start to see it's using simpler language. It's going to throw in a few analogies. It's going to talk about things in sort of the terms that a high school student might actually understand and the ways that those actually impact high school students directly. You see it's talking about apps and social media. That's probably not something that you would see in a contrasting example here, which is explaining data privacy to an executive team at a large nonprofit. And so again, it says, I'm starting conceptually here. You can tell it's kind of like, I know that what you're asking isn't going to give you really great output. So here's just an overview. It's talking about spam and marketing rules, CASL. It's talking about the core principles. And again, it's narrowing down, volunteers in HR, talking about breaches and governance models. And if you look through here, you even see it's starting to talk about funders and funder requirements and those kinds of things. So you get some of this built in by getting a better prompt in the first place. And so I'm going to change gears a little bit with this context one, but we're going to talk about being an expert at Canadian privacy legislation for a home care worker organization. And we recently had a near miss where an employee leaked some sensitive information. explain data privacy for employees who are mostly hands-on and may not recognize the seriousness of seemingly innocuous information. And it gives you things that apply more specifically. So home addresses, health diagnoses, and then it talks specifically about things that might be innocuous. And again, just a general overview. So we want to bring in that example or format element. And we're going to say the same thing, but I need a one-page overview to post up in common areas and a brief email that'll get the core point across, even if it's only skimmed. And so it's going to post up all of this together. And I should say I've separated these into separate prompts, the idea being that you want to get good at getting what you want the first time, but don't be afraid to kind of engage in a dialogue. You could easily build off of this last prompt here and say, hey, can you turn this, exactly right here, can you turn this into a privacy for home care workers handout? And you can build on your original prompt if you realize, hey, this is what I actually need. So natural conversation is really helpful, but it spits out this document, which I'll say frankly isn't actually that great. There's way too many bullets and people are going to, glaze over pretty quickly on this. So I'd ask for some refinements, but I will say that the email that it comes up with is quite good. It says, if you don't only read the bullet parts, please remember, do not post anything even without names. And in fact, this is actually kind of a tell. If you're reading emails that you're getting, if it has all this random bolding in it, it's probably something they got out of ChatGPT. The M- isn't your only clue, but you get something useful. And so that's where this becomes useful, is in the sense of creating a prompt that you put in once and you get some output you can use right away. You're trying to minimize the amount of conversation and rework you have to do. And that's what makes these models powerful. And so just jumping back a couple slides here quickly, if you aren't getting the results that you want, you do need to go back and think about, did I give it all the information I need in order to get the output that I was hoping to get? And that's really the skill that I'm hoping to impart here, is that as you do this more and more, especially for those of you who aren't using it much, you kind of have to push through and say, I missed that. Next time I need to do this. Next time I need to do this. And that's really what's going to build that practice of getting the benefit out of these tools. And so all that kind of filters down to a core concept, which is knowing what you actually want. I personally think that the number one reason for bad AI outputs isn't necessarily bad prompting. That isn't to say that there isn't a lot of jobs that AI is not well suited for, or there aren't a whole ton of other issues related to AI and what's going on in the world right now. But it's when you get this output that isn't great, it probably has something to do with communicating what you actually need, which most people probably know isn't just an AI problem. I can't tell you how many times I've sent an email to someone and the response I get back makes me immediately think, did I really think through the request that I made to that person? And so you want to just think that if you give it a vague input, you're going to get a vague output. It doesn't fill in the gaps. It's just going to try really hard to give you something that you can use, and often you can't. Any questions about that before I move on to the next concept? Okay, really just catching my breath there. And so moving beyond task execution, things that fit neatly in a little box, maybe you put it in automations, we want to start thinking about using AI as a thought partner. And that's the idea that you're going to let it help you think through the problem. Maybe you're not clear on what you're actually looking for, or maybe you just need some sort of thinking feedback about a problem you're trying to solve. And I think this is really an undervalued use of AI. I've found many scenarios where it helps you fill in gaps. It's not doing the thinking for me, but it is helping me think of things that I might not have considered otherwise. Because it has such a massive set of training data. And in fact, this concept comes from a book called The AI-Driven Leader, written by a guy named Jeff Woods. He did a little talk on it that some of my colleagues saw and said it was really awesome. And he uses this, what he calls the interview method and crit prompting methodology to get better results. And it even works for the types of scenarios we were talking about in the past. And I'll get to sort of where you would separate these. And the example he gives is a executive who's having a problem with a Japanese partner of theirs overseas. And he describes a scenario and says, interview me about this problem. And it comes up with a solution that he would not have otherwise thought of, because it has a massive amount of Japanese cultural context that, this businessman who works with some Japanese people didn't have. And so it can really introduce some knowledge or some context that you personally didn't have. And if you do it right, you can draw on that. to help you improve not just your prompting, but your business experience. And so looking at this CRIT framework, you'll see three familiar elements. We've got context, role, and task. But then the new one here is the interview element. And there's a couple of really important elements in this. Number one is specifying how many questions. I usually would say 3 and maybe up to 5, depending on the question, but there's diminishing returns. Show you that in just a moment here. And then the other element is 1 at a time. So instead of just throwing 3 questions at you, which might work, it can then specify the next question based on the input from the prior question. And so I'll just quickly jump over and show you what can happen if, wrong window, if you just say, hey, I've got this scenario. You're a business and life coach. I'm an employee at an MSP. I'm having issues with timelines due to a colleague who's not pulling their weight. Ask me some questions to understand the dynamics and context. And so it says, I'll ask you up to 10. This actually used to be a lot worse. This is when this talk was given, it would typically throw about 20 to 30 questions at you right out of the gate. They've narrowed it down to 10, but even 10, these are useful questions to understand the situation, but only some of them are actually going to provide much value, and it would take you quite a while to answer these questions. And so by saying, I only want you to ask 3 questions or 5 questions, and I want you to ask me one at a time, you can really do that narrowing down that provides so much value and time savings. And so I'm going to jump over to that same scenario here. And this is contrived. I want to promise you I don't have any colleagues that do this stuff to me. But so we have the same prompt, but we said, ask me 3 questions, one at a time, to understand the dynamics. Help me draft a strategy for addressing this. And so it says, when timelines flip, what is the dependency? What are you waiting for? How is it handed off? And what's a concrete example? And I said, we're on different teams. I'm responsible for client delivery, and I rely on them to produce the output. A recent example is that it was delivered to me late the day before, so I had to work late to complete it on time. And it says, as a response, question 2, what visibility or control do you have before it gets there? Do you do regular syncs or SLAs? And when you notice the risk early, what do you do and how do they respond? So it's actually kind of forcing in a few questions here, but that's better than answering that list of 10. I don't have visibility. When we're getting down to the wire, I'll send them a message and ask them when it's going to be done, and they're going to say, I'm sorry, I'm busy, I can't finish. And so, third question, what are you actually looking as an outcome, 1 to 2? And what's the main constraint you're worried about? And so this is where some of the information that really helps starts to come out. I say, I don't want to have to work late often. It doesn't happen a lot, but it is getting frustrating. And this person and I are friends outside of work, and we're both overloaded, so I don't want to damage the friendship by making a big deal out of it. And so it says, hey, there's actually some really important details you've given me here. Here's some suggestions on how you should handle this. And by default, it's going to give you quite a long bit of information. But again, I think the idea is that you're getting a lot of context so you can narrow down. And so just as a suggestion for what I would do next here is I would pick some element of it that seems interesting to me, and I would ask some questions about it. And I don't actually have to type out everything it said. I said, you give me number 8 here. What should I do if they don't respond and just blame management like they have in the past? And it starts to kind of narrow down and give you some strategies and some next steps. And you can kind of work through this with the tool and also say, be brief, because it does have a tendency to say a lot more than you actually need. That's a really good tip. You can customize those settings in ChatGPT as well to say how much output you generally want. And so actually have one other example here. What are we doing for time? We got lots. So I'm going to go back over to that privacy violation question, and we can do perhaps a little bit of live prompting. Let me get over here. And so what was the near miss? I do have some prepared notes for this. There we go. Copy and paste. And so in this scenario, someone named Maria was caring for an elderly client, and they made a Facebook post when that person passed away and gave some details that weren't appropriate. This is actually asking 5 questions, but I should have set that to 3. So who exactly was the audience? And who else saw it? So let's say, and literacy considerations, we don't necessarily need no literacy considerations. And you can see because care workers tend to have a wide variety of skills in terms of language, it's actually bringing that up directly for us to address. What policies and tools do we have in place? We have a training program, but people are only required to use it once when they're hired. Oops. And actually, this is a really important point. Most of the models don't care. If you spell badly, they'll figure it out. But if you spell badly a lot, then it might actually start spelling badly itself. So documentation is available, but people never reference it. Let's jump to your answer. And so if it's asking too many questions, we can just tell it, skip ahead. And then it's going to give us the poster. And this poster, again, it's short. It actually gives some examples based on what we talked about in the incident. And then the companion email is a little bit longer, but again, it's talking specifically about social media. People are going to know that there was some kind of social media incident, and then you can narrow down from there. So that's just two scenarios where crit is helpful. This one's really hard to demonstrate except in very unique scenarios. I think that there is so much potential for this to help you. It's a really great way to approach task-based prompting. But when you have a scenario, and specifically in the book, he talks about asking for 5 unique strategies, that can really help as well. You're very likely to find something you hadn't expected out of this methodology. The other thing I want to show you while I'm doing the demo is the idea of 2 different methods of prompting. You'll see, I think on this one, we actually broke it down into context, role, interview, and task, where in most of the other ones, we kind of did it more conversationally. And both are fine, but when you are building something for a repeatable solution, so I'm just going to give you an example here of a prompt. This is something similar to what I use, but not exactly. I just sanitize it a bit. But when I'm preparing for a meeting, I will bring up this prompt, which tells it about me and my business, a little bit of background on me, background on our firm and our strategy, your role as a CFO advisory consultant. You use the logic of these thinkers. And again, they're trained on the internet. So these people's blog posts and other social media and sort of their rationale will bleed into what's being responded to here. I ask for the interview method, and then I've got the task. And so I say, after the interview, help me build an agenda, talking points, and executive summary geared towards this client. And so I'll just throw this directly in to a new chat. You can use a project or a custom GPT. I'm sure some of the experts are shaking their fists at me about that right now, but this is, a lot of people do it this way. They just have a library of these prompts that are structured quite well. They spent a lot of time thinking through them, and it just sets you up to have success. And so it's going to start asking me questions about the client and the different scenarios. And I've found some really great success. If you are a client and you've seen one of my recent executive summaries, this was a part of that strategy to get something that's better than what I wrote before. A little bit of showing you how the cake is made. And then one other thing I want to show you here is actually verifying information. So this is a scenario. I've said I'm learning to ride the motorcycle. I'm 38 years old. I got 3 kids and no life insurance policy. My friend says it's really dangerous, but I don't believe him. Help me make a good decision here. And I used the deep thinking mode. So it thought for 7 minutes and it pulled up a ton of various sources. You can actually see the thinking when it does this long thinking here, and you can see the sources that it's using in here, but you'll see these little links down here. So, the Highway Transportation Safety Authority PDF and all the findings in there. And so it's claiming, 15% of all traffic deaths. I can actually go into the document and verify this information myself. So back to that question that was being asked earlier, they actually do make it fairly easy. Sometimes you have to ask for it. If you notice that it doesn't have any of these links, there's a very good chance that it's just making it up. It's pulling it from its set of training data. It didn't go out to the internet to verify or pull real-time information. And so that can be something that you can prompt it to do. You say, find sources, give me verifiable sources, and then pull those links so you can see. So here's some, a CDC link, and you can go and, so this should be a clue that maybe this one isn't accurate because it's linking to a document that doesn't exist. And so you might want to say, hey, I didn't actually get a link for this piece of text. Can you please verify this and give me a link I can verify? And that's part of your strategy for verification. I think that's it for the demo section here. Let's jump back to my slides. Doing good on time. Oh, come on. There we go. And so, yeah, the key with the CRIT methodology is the back and forth corroboration, not just one-way execution. And so I've talked about this a bit already, but there is sort of a fork in the road depending on what you're trying to accomplish. There's the task-focused frameworks with the, the role, context, audience, and everything. Those are good for one shot. I want a specific product, especially in automations. If you're using a Power Automate script or something like that, and you don't get to have input, it's just going to do this in the background. You kind of have to use one of these frameworks. You don't get the chance to answer interview questions that it's going to ask you. But in most other cases, especially complex multi-layered problems where you need strategic thinking, or again, you just don't really know how to address the problem, even fundamentally, the interview method is going to save you a lot of time and get you a better answer than it would if you were, sitting on your own and thinking about it from scratch. These tools are very good at building their own prompts. In fact, that's a tip that I'll mention as well. If you're working on one of these larger prompts, you can throw it into the AI model and say, hey, here's my prompt and what I'm trying to accomplish. Can you help me format this or add or remove certain elements to get a better end result? And it'll help you do that. That's how that project scoping tool I was talking about earlier was built. And so they're both useful. It just depends on the situation you're in exactly. Looks like we've got a question here. Is it okay to ask AI for future outcomes, like what sales promos to consider for Valentine's Day? Yeah, I think that's a great scenario where you can use AI. Again, it's going to be based on the information in its training set and things that it can find on the internet. It doesn't know how to predict the future necessarily, but it is, just like human beings, we're basing our future predictions on the past as well. So hopefully that answers your question. If you need to clarify further, feel free to add some more context there while I move forward. And so I told you I would start talking about how prompt engineering is maybe not necessarily becoming less relevant, but it's not the whole picture. And there's this concept called context engineering, popularized by, I'm going to butcher this, but Andrej Karpathy. He's the former head of AI at Tesla and OpenAI founder. And he says that what you put into the chat box, even a very involved prompt, is really only 5% of what determines the output. When you think about the whole picture of what is going on when that LLM is responding to your prompt, there is even just the system prompt itself. This is sort of the instructions that OpenAI or XAI or whatever have set to tell the large language model how to respond, what not to respond to, its personality, all that kind of, all the rules. That prompt is 10 times longer than anything you're going to put into that model to begin with. And that's not to say all the documents it can see, the data, the internet, your chat history with it. And so there's a lot of other information that goes into the context that determines the output that you're getting. So the prompt is really valuable in determining exactly what you get, but more value comes from controlling what the AI actually sees more broadly. And so this concept is more aimed at people who are building AI solutions or the way that, Anthropic is building Claude, but we do have an element in this in terms of controlling what the AI sees and what it has access to. And so if you want to build real organizational leverage, you want the AI to have a good understanding of your business. It needs access to your company data, your policies, your full customer context, like your client history, relationships, all that kind of thing. These are things that come into the responses and the documents that you generate automatically. You know these things intuitively, or maybe you'll reference documentation within your document, like your data. But you want the AI to have this capability as well. It's not just clever prompting that determines valuable output here. It's thoughtful architecture. The frameworks are kind of like the training wheels, whereas the real business systems are going to know about your business automatically, not just dragging in individual documents about, your project templates and that sort of thing. You can ask the AI to say, hey, generate me a project template that looks like the one we did last week, and it's going to go find that within your documentation system. And so this is really controlling the context of that AI is what's going to move you from just using AI tools to, AI being integrated deeply within your organization. But like anything, that doesn't happen necessarily easily and not without risks. And so there's a few things you need to consider before you go and hit that, connector button between SharePoint and ChatGPT. Is data leakage. So your settings need to be configured properly. Most of the paid models will do this by default. Copilot uses enterprise data protection to limit how much information from your organization gets into the public model, which should be none. But there's also risks like malicious actors gaining access to your systems and suddenly having a little buddy that can help them figure out exactly what they need from your organization very quickly. If your CEO gets hacked, then the attacker has to download all the information or has to go searching manually for all the information. Now they can just say, tell me about all the upcoming transactions over $50,000. It'll spit everything over that's documented in their email or in other people's mailboxes they can see, and very quickly gain knowledge that it would take them a lot of time to gather otherwise. The other threat here is insider threats. I think this isn't a great way to state it, but are you absolutely sure that all of your HR data, payroll information, sensitive information within your organization is in the right folders, the permissions are set correctly, or could somebody accidentally discover something when they're asking an innocuous question or actively trying to find that information using the AI agent that now has access to this data as well? And then the last thing, and this is the one that's going to impact people the most, is inefficiency. So if you look at your data, let's say that project template example I just gave you, if you've got 18 different versions of your project template or an SOP on how to produce a project, and they're all from the last 20 years, then how does the AI know which one to use? If you have redundant or outdated information, that's going to make your AI agent more inefficient. So you have to do some prep work to make sure that things are structured in a way that is actually going to gain leverage. And so the organizations getting the real value from AI aren't just the ones that moved quickly, they're the ones that are also moving thoughtfully. And so, keep clicking on the images. That's where I want to introduce our lab series. If you've been to any of the other sessions, we kind of lead into these more directly, but the idea is that we have a series of AI labs available to our customers or external clients where we can help you go through this process of discovering how AI is being used in your organization already, developing policy on how it can be used, who's allowed to use it, what is allowed, what isn't, doing that governance, so making sure that your documents are organized properly, your permissions are set so that you're not going to get yourself into trouble, and then actually starting to build implementations and build leverage with these tools. If you are interested in this, please reach out, info@smartdolphins.com, and we'll be happy to send you over a brochure that talks about this in a bit more detail. And I think, that's about what I have to offer today. Hopefully there was some useful information in there. I want to send you away with a couple of tasks. I want you to go out and try a framework. Doesn't matter which one. Just give it a shot and see how it impacts the way that you're prompting AI. Give the interview method a try, especially the constrained ask me one question at a time method. You may be surprised by what happens in that situation. Start building your library. Especially I would suggest things like your business context. You could probably have a block of text about your business or about yourself that you would reuse in multiple different prompts over and over again. You can do that in a custom GPT or a project, or we'll talk about those in an upcoming session. But for now, on OneNote that you keep all your different prompts in is a useful tool that you'll find saves you a lot of time long term. And then, like I said, really at the end of the day, don't give up. keep trying, keep iterating. There are many ways that these can be useful. You'll discover some situations where, as was mentioned earlier, it actually takes you longer to do it with AI than not, but don't assume that will always be the case the first time you try something. If you really can't make it work, then, maybe that's just something you always do, but there are use cases out there and people are discovering them every day. These are very new tools. And so continuous improvement is really the key. Build momentum.